There we go. So starting out, what is hyperbaric oxygen therapy? And as I just mentioned, it's been essentially an unanswered question for about 347 years, at least up till about 2008. But the physiologic definition is that it's a dual component drug that uses increased pressure and increased oxygen to treat diseases. And it was the FDA who pointed this out in 2011, when for the first time, hyperbaric oxygen was put under the drug section of the FDA, medical gas section. Prior to that, it'd been under the devices section and always thought as well it's a treatment delivered in a chamber. But they posed a question to me, and it led to this understanding, which I hope is going to inform everybody here that we're in a whole new era now. The functional definition is that we are using a treatment that exploits all living organisms' sensitivity to pressure and oxygen. And of course, we all understand that living organisms are sensitive to oxygen. Without it, none of us would be alive. No living organism would exist. But how about pressure? What is pressure? We live with it. We don't think about it. But atmospheric pressure is the weight of air from the elevation of whatever you're at, standing wherever on the Earth, to the boundary of the Earth's atmosphere, which is about 62 miles up or around 100 kilometers. And that atmospheric pressure is the weight of that air in that distance. Hydrostatic pressure on the other, at the other end of the spectrum then, is that weight of seawater at whatever depth you're at below the surface of the ocean. And so just to put this all in one graph, on the left-hand side here is pounds per square inch going all the way from 0, which would be outer space and 60,000 feet altitude essentially. And on the right side is altitude, the equivalent altitude elevation. So at 0 atmospheres pressure there at the bottom on the left-hand side here, right there, are, we are way up in the 60,000 feet and above altitude. And of course, here is sea level roughly at 14.7 pounds per square inch. And unfortunately, this the video thing is over my graph, but sea level is right here. And then below sea level, we're going up in pressure. Whoops, excuse me. We're going up in pressure. And here's the PSI. So sea level, we're here, altitude, lower pressures, below sea level, much higher. Well, here's the safe zone that humans exist in, with oxygen, of course, as we get up to altitude. But if we look at this, on Earth, birds, in fact, different species are found at different altitudes. And the same thing with plants and animals. They thrive at particular altitudes. If we go below sea level, the flora and fauna also are distributed by pressure. Now, there's actually an oxygen level as well, but they are very sensitive to that pressure depth, and that's where they live and thrive. And here, of course, are the fish and the different species that are found as we go down. So if we go back to the altitude and look at, atmospheric pressure, it's essentially the weight from the surface of air all the way up to about, 100 kilometers. And when you're underwater, it's that weight to wherever you are below the surface. Well, as it turns out, every chemical reaction in every living organism is affected by pressure. And pressure is a thermodynamic intensity parameter. This is the most math you're going to get and talk about this, but I want to make a key point with this little equation here. It's the free energy of any chemical reaction, and right smack dab in the middle of it is pressure, which means that essentially every chemical reaction in our body is affected by the pressure that we are at. Now, it can be just a small effect, but it can also be a very large effect. So when we take this to a hyperbaric chamber, the second that chamber door is closed, we are affecting our physiology, our chemical reactions, and what has now been shown and not been understood, literally the 360 years of this, the existence of this therapy, is that we are affecting over 8,101 of our 19,000 protein coding genes in our 46 chromosomes. And this is an effect that's unique in all of medicine. But to get that effect, you have to expose the entire body to increased pressure. And the only way to do that is put yourself in an enclosed chamber, i.e. a hyperbaric chamber. And this is an example of just a hard shell chamber with a patient in there. So what happens when you increase barometric pressure? Well, in 2011, when I had applied to the FDA to get an investigational new drug exemption to do the TBI study that we published in March of 2020, right at the pandemic outbreak, they sent me back a response. I was asking for a special protocol permission that if we got positive data with this protocol, could we use it for a new FDA indication for hyperbaric oxygen? And they wrote back and they said, look, wait a minute, you're just asking for one dose, and we view your therapy as a combination of increased pressure and increased oxygen. And we don't know whether either, both, or neither of them have a biological effect. You got to prove that. And I'd been in this field 26 years up to that point. I thought they were crazy because no one at a clinical meeting, at any hyperbaric discussion, in writing textbooks, nowhere had anybody said anything about the bioactivity of pressure. So when the going gets tough, the tough go to the library. And I went to the library, and what did I find? This article in 1998, summarizing roughly 50 years of basic science research showing that even small amounts of pressure, look at the pressure up here, 1.0015, that's about a centimeter, to 1.3 atmospheres. What is that? The pressure limit of portable chambers in the United States. And within this range, they were documenting all sorts of biological effects. And so I kind of distilled that down. And this is in an article that you can look up, the reference on the bottom there, but 1.21 to 1.26 atmospheres. Look at this, 1.0015 to 1.015 to animal, human cells for 15 minutes or longer, causing all of these effects: elaboration of proteins, hormones, cell proliferation. And the activity started after just 1 minute of exposure. So, we're in a whole new world here, appreciating what this therapy actually is doing. And if we look, let me switch my video bar here for a second. If we look at the physiologic effects of pressure, I'm going to translate this to a very known commodity here, the ventilator. So the hospital ventilator that we are using in an ICU, what they did in this experiment was take alveolar macrophages from bronchoscopy. They washed the lung, got the macrophages, plated them, and they constructed this cell strain apparatus that delivered the identical pressure that a ventilator breath delivered, 0.07 atmospheres. They measured various things with the cells, and what they found was it activated NF-kappa beta, which is a main activator of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So think of what happens with COVID patients. Once you get on a ventilator, it's almost a death sentence. The mortality is extremely high. And what this is showing us is some of the mechanism of how this injury occurs. Also activates interleukin-8, TNF-alpha, IL-6, all of these things. And the ventilator plus lipopolysaccharide, which is an inflammatory mediator, had a synergistic effect. The whole point was mechanical ventilation induces inflammation and may be particularly deleterious in pre-injured or infected lungs. And that's what the LPS was showing. And of course, it may explain what happens to COVID patients when they go on a ventilator. So let me advance here. We're essentially, the physiologic definition was that treatment that uses increased pressure, increased oxygen, and we're using them as drugs to treat diseases. Well, it kind of begs the question, what kind of diseases? It turns out they're wounding conditions. And hyperbaric oxygen is essentially a treatment for wounds in any location and any duration. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. And how do we treat wounds with hyperbaric oxygen? What we're doing is we're repairing tissue and growing new tissue. And so the daily input here of a hyperbaric exposure, the output is reversal of the pathophysiology and repair and growth of tissue. And how do you do that? You've got to be able to stimulate cells to multiply and divide. So what's the definition, or I should say the mechanism of action? it's gene signaling, as it turns out. And this was shown in a series of experiments going back to 1997. But if we look at our DNA, and on the left-hand side here is just a picture of the double-stranded DNA, and it's in a supercoil. In the center are histone and other proteins with their reactive moieties, which are these color proteins that sit on the outside. These colored proteins, as it turns out, are where the epigenetic effects occur. So lifestyle, drugs, stress, all of the things we know that can affect gene expression are usually affecting these outside moieties. And when there's an interaction with it, let's say a chemical or a pesticide or something, it changes the conformation of the protein, the electrical charge, and it opens up the gene. And so here's just another schematic of it, our double helix and these proteins that are strung along and then in the supercoil. Well, so what is happening is, it turns out hyperbaric oxygen is acting at these epigenetic foci. The pressure and oxygen somehow is opening or closing the initial part of the genes and allowing them to be read. And this finally came to light in 2009. And here was the experiment. What they did was take skin biopsies from patients, and they separated out normal blood vessels and the tiniest blood vessels that are lined by what are called endothelial cells. These are the most reactive cells in our body. They put them in a petri dish and put them in a hyperbaric chamber and gave them one hyperbaric treatment. You can see the pressure right there, 2.4 atmospheres, 60 minutes. And they did a continuous gene array analysis. At the end of 24 hours, 8,101 of our 19,000 protein coding genes were turned off. The effect again was on the epigenetic part, those proteins controlling the genes. The largest clusters of genes turned on, and this is the key to our talk today, were the anti-inflammatory genes and the growth and repair hormone genes, i.e., repairing wounds, healing wounds. And the largest clusters of the temporarily suppressed genes were the pro-inflammatory genes and the ones that control cell death. So every hyperbaric treatment, we are stimulating growth and repair hormones and wound repair, inhibiting inflammation, and turning off cell death in areas of wounding in the body. If they gave a second hyperbaric treatment at 24 hours, the cells began to round up and form microtubules like blood vessels. This is in a petri dish. So the effect of pressure and oxygen on cells in our DNA is just profound. So what is the mechanism? We are modulating gene expression and suppression. It's an epigenetic gene therapy. And now let's go and look at how hyperbaric oxygen is used. In the US, we have this very narrow, limited number of diagnoses. And there's the list. You can read them. Air or gas embolism, which is air in an artery, carbon monoxide poisoning, crush injuries, decompression sickness, which is diver's disease. Everybody's heard of that. Problem wounds like diabetic foot wounds, exceptional blood loss, massive blood loss like getting shot and bleeding out before you die. You deliver hyperbaric to them, you can keep them alive. Radiation tissue damage. All of these, if you look at them, are wounding conditions. And the rest of them, skin grafts and flaps that are not healing, thermal burns, central retinal artery occlusion, which is a stroke of the eye, sudden blindness. Number 11 is sudden hearing loss. And then the last five, or the last four, are infections that cause wounds. So gas gangrene, the flesh-eating bacteria, et cetera. All of them, however, are wound conditions. Well, what happens if you go to Russia? They've got 70 diseases they treat. China, 49, Japan, 33, and 15 in the US. So, what is this therapy? A treatment for every disease? There was a critical article written in 1987 by Dr. Gavin Robin from Stanford. They identified 130 diseases hyperbaric have been applied to over 350 years. It turns out when you look at all of them, the vast majority are wounding and inflammatory conditions. My experience, I've treated about 90 to 100 different conditions, most of which are neurological. And how can you do that? How can you treat so many different diseases with one therapy? And the reason is we're not treating the disease, we're treating the underlying disease processes, the pathophysiology that cause those diseases. And it turns out those processes are common to many, many diseases. And they're sensitive to hyperbaric oxygen at varying pressures and oxygen levels. So if we look at the common wound pathophysiology, it is ischemia, which is no blood flow or low blood flow, hypoxia, which is low oxygen, and inflammation, which is dominant in almost all of them. Well, what kind of evidence do we have for the treatment of inflammation? And this is where this whole talk is going. This, I put in here, there are 7 of them, but here are 5, 6. There are 7 review articles on hyperbaric oxygen therapy effects on inflammation. They are widespread. In this one here, which was looking at it in inflammatory bowel disease, they cited a whole bunch of animal and human literature that inhibited inflammation. And they listed some of the cytokines and interleukins and so on. This one is effective hyperbaric oxygen inflammatory response in wound and trauma. Again, same type of thing, showing broad effects on inflammation and suppression of inflammation. Well, we also have one of the most inflammatory conditions, which is the adult respiratory distress syndrome. And the reason I put this in, you will see in a minute. But when you are severely injured, such as trauma or overwhelming infection, the lungs can go into a state of almost shock, if you will, but it's called the adult respiratory distress syndrome. And here's an article on burned patients, controlled study. One group got hyperbaric oxygen treatment, one did not. And they separated out and took a look at those on a ventilator with ARDS. They had 20 with hyperbaric oxygen, 10 who were on the vent with ARDS, and they had 8 controls, didn't get hyperbaric oxygen, 5 on the vent with ARDS. They delivered hyperbaric oxygen. They had no deleterious effect. And what did they find? In this intense inflammatory condition of the lungs, they had a more rapid weaning from the mechanical ventilator in the hyperbaric group, 5.3 days versus 26. Now think of ICU expense and on a ventilator, what a huge change this was. They also, a lower mortality, 23% in ARDS patients. Well, I should say it was a lower mortality in that group, but in a separate study, which is number 2 there, which was a case series of all hyperbaric patients on mechanical ventilation treated at this one site, their mortality on the low end of the historical mortality for all patients for ARDS. So the point is the hyperbaric oxygen is inhibiting inflammation in lungs, and we see this in ARDS. We have evidence for it. And this is going to directly address what I'm going to talk about here with COVID. There's also another study that was done on ARDS, and this is in people who had severe chest trauma. 45 of them, 26 of them developed ARDS within 3 days of the trauma. And they had very low oxygen levels. That's a ratio there. But 8 of the 26 received hyperbaric oxygen, and the other 18 got standard supportive care. Hyperbaric treatment, if you look at it, these numbers, kind of put this in your mind for a minute, 1.6 to 2 atmospheres for just 4 to 15 treatments and only 40 to 60 minutes. Look at the mortality. None of the hyperbaric patients died. 77% of the control patients died. So evidence that this is effectively treating ARDS. Well, how about the application to acute COVID infection?